He bragged about owning a cattle farm. 10 minutes later, he admitted he was too broke to buy drugs. That single contradiction, that one slip, is how we knew. This wasn't just some creep hiding behind a screen name. This was the easiest Mark we would ever meet in our lives. By the end of the story, he will have mixed up a batch of fake cocaine in his mother's kitchen, snorted it, bled from the nose, driven himself to a clinic, and thanked us for the recipe. This is the story of Farmer Bob. If you've ever wanted to watch an internet predator get exactly what's coming to him, not through violence, not through the law, but through nothing more than his own greed and stupidity, you are going to love this one. Hit like, subscribe, and settle in, because what you're about to hear is one of the most satisfying, most ridiculous gotcha stories the early internet ever produced. To understand this story, you have to understand what the internet actually looked like in the autumn of 1999. No smartphones, no social media feeds, no algorithms quietly watching your every move. Just clunky, text-based chat rooms, the kind where a page loaded slowly, sounds chirp out of your modem like a robot clearing its throat, and you typed in a nickname before you were dropped into a scrolling wall of green or gray text. There was no login screen, no verification, no permanent record of who you really were behind the screen name you chose that day. For a lot of people, that anonymity felt like freedom, a blank page where you could be funny, be bold, be someone slightly different than you were at school or at home. For predators, it was something else entirely. It was a hunting ground with no cameras. Picture the room itself, a scrolling column of one-line messages, dozens of conversations tangled together in real time, and buried underneath all of it, a quieter channel called a whisper. A private message, invisible to everyone except the one person it was aimed at. It was meant for flirting, for jokes, for private conversation between friends. Predators used it differently. They used it to isolate. A grown man could sit in a room full of teenagers and young adults, pick out the quietest, newest, most unsure-sounding voice in the crowd, and slide a private message straight into her inbox, never once announcing himself to the group, never once giving anyone else the chance to notice. Slowly, patiently, one whisper at a time. And when it worked, the requests always escalated the same way. What's your email? Do you have a picture? Can we talk somewhere more private? There was no report button, no trust and safety team, no terms of service to violate. If something happened to you in that room, it happened to you alone, unless you had people watching your back. That's exactly what one particular chat room had managed to build. We'll call it the attic, because, like a lot of these communities, it eventually spilled out beyond the chat itself into its own little corner of the early web, a bulletin board, a member list, a running document of known predators and their tactics. It wasn't official. Nobody granted anyone a badge. You earned trust the old-fashioned way, by showing up, by being decent to people, by getting vouched for by someone who already belonged. And when a predator got exposed, the addict's default weapon was almost comically petty and devastatingly effective. The moment somebody confirmed a creep, word would spread through the group in seconds, and then, one by one, members would flood his private whisper inbox with the same block of copy-pasted nonsense, over and over, hundreds of times a minute. Control+C, Control+V, enter. Control+V, enter. To him, it looked like his entire screen dissolving into an unreadable wall of garbage. To his internet connection, built on dial-up modems that could barely handle one real conversation at a time, it was a death sentence. His connection would choke, lag, and eventually drop entirely. 95% of predators who got exposed in the attic gave up after that. They logged off, and as far as anyone could tell, they never came back under that name again. This story is about the other 5%, the stubborn ones, the slippery ones. This story is about Farmer Bob. Our narrator was 20 years old, a regular presence in the attic, well-liked, quick with a joke, generally more of an observer than a ringleader. His girlfriend was 21, and she was something else entirely. She'd been one of the founding members of the community, one of the very first to start compiling that running list of known predators. Among the regulars, she had a reputation that was somewhere between a warning and a compliment. People joked, half seriously, that she was more evil than the devil himself whenever a creep crossed a line. She didn't panic. She didn't get flustered. She got creative. And once she decided someone deserved it, she committed completely. And then there was the man who would come to be known forever as Farmer Bob. Online, he went by a different, ordinary-sounding name, Roy Kessler. Nothing about the name itself raised any flags. That was part of what made him dangerous. Where most predators announce themselves within days, too eager, too pushy, too obvious, Kessler was patient, low-key. He'd been quietly active in the group for weeks before anyone put the pieces together. It wasn't a dramatic reveal that exposed him. It was something quieter and far more damning. A handful of the younger members of the community, the ones the whole netiquette system existed to protect in the first place, started independently reporting the same pattern. Unwanted emails, unwanted messages that had started innocent and slowly turned personal, then uncomfortable. Different girls. Same tactics. Same rhythm. That was enough. Our narrator and his girlfriend made the call. It was time to deal with Roy Kessler themselves. She logged in that night under a brand new screen name. Sweet, unsure, clearly new to the room. It's an old trick, but it works precisely because predators are looking for exactly that signal. Newness. Uncertainty. Someone who hasn't learned yet who to avoid. Kessler took the bait almost immediately. He slid into her messages within the hour, charming in that overly attentive way that feels flattering for about 30 seconds before it starts to feel like a leash tightening. Over the following conversations, a picture of Roy Kessler began to take shape, and the picture was almost comically inconsistent from the very start. He said he lived out in the country. He said his family owned a cattle farm, a big one, profitable, generational. He implied, without quite saying it outright, that he could take care of a woman financially if things between them went somewhere serious. And unprompted, more than once, he brought up the fact that he always wore wooden clogs around the farm, convinced, apparently, that women found this detail devastatingly attractive. It didn't take long for the two of them, reading his messages together and stifling laughter, to reach an important conclusion. Roy Kessler wasn't smart. He wasn't even average. He was a man narrating a character to himself that he couldn't keep consistent for more than one conversation in a row. So she decided to find out exactly how far that inconsistency went. She told Kessler she might be interested in meeting up in person, if he could get his hands on some cocaine first. She told him it always put her in a certain kind of mood. This was the test. This was the moment they expected him to either back off, get suspicious, or at the very least ask a normal follow-up question. Instead, barely an hour after bragging about his family's cattle empire, Roy Kessler admitted that he couldn't actually afford it. Sit with that for a second. A supposedly wealthy farm owner, unable to scrape together cash for drugs he'd just been asked to provide. Nobody called him out on a contradiction. Nobody had to. He just kept talking, without realizing it, handing them more and more rope. He mentioned, almost as an afterthought, that his parents would be away that coming weekend. The same parents whose farm he'd claimed, an hour earlier, to already own outright. That's the moment the girlfriend decided to stop testing the waters and see exactly how deep this thing could go. She typed out a message engineered to be so absurd that any rational adult would immediately recognize it as a joke. Wait, you didn't know? If you mix 3 parts baking soda with 1 part vanilla sugar, you get a rush just as good as cocaine, and it actually tastes good too. They hit send, sat back, and waited for the con to collapse under its own weight. Surely this was the line. Surely no grown man would. Kessler thanked her, said he'd genuinely forgotten about that trick. Said he'd whip up a batch that same evening, try it out, and make sure the quality was good before she came to visit. They logged off in stunned disbelief, half convinced that once the excitement of the conversation faded, common sense would quietly catch up with him somewhere between the kitchen cabinet and the sink. It didn't. A couple of days later, an email dropped into their inbox, written entirely in furious, shaking, all-caps rage. Kessler accused the girlfriend of tricking him, said his nose had started bleeding so badly that he'd had to drive himself to a clinic. He was humiliated. He was seething, because he had actually done it, actually stood in his own kitchen, actually measured out baking soda and vanilla sugar, and actually snorted it, on nothing but the word of a woman he had never met in person, because he wanted so badly for it to be true that basic self-preservation simply never entered the equation. They didn't let him off the hook there, either. Rather than let him quietly lick his wounds and disappear, the girlfriend doubled down, spinning the story further, insisting the mistake must have been on his end, dangling one more reason for him to stay hooked and keep humiliating himself. True to form, Kessler bought every word of it, right down to begging for more. And then, finally, silence. No more emails. No more messages. Whether he finally connected the dots on his own, or simply couldn't bear the embarrassment of continuing. Nobody in the attic ever heard from Roy Kessler again. The reports from the younger members stopped, too. If he kept creeping around chat rooms after that, it wasn't under a name anyone recognized. Take a moment and actually picture it. A grown man, alone in his parents' kitchen on a Saturday night, hunched over a countertop, carefully measuring out baking soda like it's the finest product money can buy. Genuinely convinced, bone-deep convinced, that he's about to get high, because a stranger on the internet told him so, and he wanted it to be true so badly that the thought of questioning it never once crossed his mind. No lawyer, no confrontation, no shouting match, no fistfight, no dramatic showdown. Just a spoon, a countertop, a nosebleed, and a drive to a clinic he had to explain to absolutely nobody, because explaining it would mean admitting, out loud, exactly how badly, and how easily, he had been played by two people barely out of their teens. That's the thing about karma, when it's engineered by people who are patient enough to wait for it. It doesn't need to shout. It just needs the target to do the damage to himself. What stays with me about this story isn't really the prank itself, as funny as it is. It's what it represents. Before trust and safety teams. Before report buttons. Before any platform took responsibility for what happened inside its own chat rooms. It was ordinary people, mostly teenagers and young adults with dial-up connections and way too much free time, who built their own system of protection from scratch. Warning lists. Netiquette rules. A shared understanding that if the platform wasn't going to protect you, the community would. And sometimes, protecting each other looked less like a warning label and more like watching a grown man talk himself into a nosebleed because nobody bothered to stop him. Sometimes the most satisfying justice isn't the loudest. It's the quiet kind. The kind where the bad guy never even finds out exactly how, or by whom, he lost. If this story had you grinning by the end, smash that like button and drop a comment below. What's the most ridiculous way you've ever seen someone get caught in their own lie? And if you want more stories where the good guys when using nothing but patience, wit, and a little bit of creativity, subscribe, because there's plenty more where this came from.